afternoon. Hi, my name is Scotty Oliver. I'm the Assistant Director here at Talbot County. Thank you all for coming. This is a very important lecture, one of a series of really good programs we've been able to bring through partnerships with the Talbot County Historical Society. We have a quick couple of housekeeping and library announcements to make, and then we'll get started with introductions of our speaker, Dr. Small. This Saturday at 2 o'clock, we're going to be showing Wicked. This is part of a series we're doing in partnership with the Chesapeake Film Festival. It's free and open to the public, so come and join us. We also are having digital literacy classes going on during the summer, so if you're interested in learning about computers, please come and join us. And for those who have not already seen it, we have an absolutely stunning exhibit of quilts in the main part of the library brought to us by the Bayside Quilters. They will be up until October. Emergency exits are here and in the front. Water and restrooms are in the lobby. And please put your cell phones on mute. And with that, I would like to introduce the director of the Talbot Historical Society, Peggy Mooring.
How's everybody today? This is amazing to see such a big crowd here, and we thank you for that. And we know the reason why. It's because Dr. Clara Small is speaking today, and what a thrill for us. And she's opening our United States Colored Troops exhibit. So it will open tomorrow at 10 o'clock. We're open Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday from 10 to 3, and I hope you're all able to come and walk through the exhibit. So we're excited about that, but we're also excited for Dr. Small, and I know she's here somewhere. Oh, right there. Okay. If any of you have had a chance to hear her speak before, you know what is in store. And for those of you that haven't, you're in for a real treat. So thank you, Dr. Small, for making the trip up here.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's so good to see all of you and some friends and people I've known for years. And woo, it feels like home, old home week. Some of them are former students. Raise your hand. Oh my goodness. This is so nice. Thank you for coming. I am going to talk about freed slaves and freedmen from the Eastern Shore who served in the Civil War. And this is in conjunction with the exhibit that has been put on and will be opening with the Talbot County Historical Society. So it's coming together. It's called working together. Americans of African descent have often been told that as a people, we have contributed nothing to American history. All too often, the history of Americans of African descent has been relegated to a few lines in history books, or to the celebration of the lives of a few individuals of the caliber of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Ross Tubman, George Washington Carver, known as the Peanut Man, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Augustus Bailey Douglas from Talbot County, woo-hoo, Rosa Parks and others during Black History Month. Contrary to those beliefs, there is a rich history among Americans of African descent, despite 300 to 400 years of slavery and oppression. But there's one segment of our history that has been neglected, simply ignored, or brushed over. That segment is the role which blacks played in the Civil War. Americans of African descent have served in every war, every conflict and engagement in which this country has been involved. The role played by slaves or free blacks in the Civil War, however, has been mostly untold, other than in a few pictures seen on the World Wide Web, or in the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, and with the Ken Burns series, which brought the saga to light. Those examples of enlightenment are of a national level. But when we look at the national level, what do we know of the slaves and free blacks from Talbot County and on the lower eastern shore of Maryland and their involvement in the Civil War. Due to recent research, we now know that thousands of former slaves and free blacks served in the Union Army and Navy, while many others also served in the Confederacy. But that's a topic for another speech. Those slaves and free blacks who served in the Union Army and Navy from Talbot County is the subject of the exhibit, With Valor and Honors, Talbot County's United States Colored Troops. Their involvement in the war was at first precarious at best, because slaves in the border states of Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and the western counties of Virginia, which became West Virginia, were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the states in rebellion. Since the border states did not secede, the slaves in those states were not affected by it and remained enslaved. And so did the slaves in the Confederacy, because Lincoln and the Union did not control those areas. In effect, if you can't control the areas, you can't control what's going on there. At the beginning of the war, blacks were not permitted to serve in the Union or the Confederate forces because it was not a war to free the slaves or to end the institution of slavery. Even President Lincoln stated that in regards to slaves, the goal was to preserve the Union at all costs, and that he would do whatever was necessary, meaning to free the slaves, to free some and keep others in bondage, or to compensate some owners and not compensate others. The participation of former slaves in the war only became an issue after the Battle of Antietam, also known as Sharpsburg. That battle gave the Union a purported victory, and it's still debated. And Lincoln issued what became known as the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. That document took the moral purpose of the war away from the Confederacy, as well as to prevent England, France, or any other nation from recognizing the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation eventually opened the floodgates and officially allowed free blacks and some former slaves to participate in the war. Still, they had to fight for the right to fight in the war because they were not readily accepted for the war effort. However, as the war raged on and the recruiting of volunteers proved to be insufficient to satisfy the quota set by the federal government, and as many whites became disenchanted with the war effort, some whites left the state temporarily, some went to other counties, some went to other states, and others left permanently, as some went to Canada and the British Isles. Some paid fees not to participate in the war effort, while others purchased substitutes so they did not have to fight. But the tide slowly changed, and public sentiment began to change in favor of the use of black troops. While many whites evaded the draft, many blacks, slave and free, tried to volunteer their services, but they were rejected. After a few months, as the war dragged on, free blacks and slaves were mustered into the Union Army and Navy, primarily due to the work of Frederick Augustus Bailey Douglas, a former slave from none other than Talbot County. Douglas was responsible for the formation of the famed 54th Massachusetts and other regiments as he traveled from state to state and from city to city in order to recruit black troops. He even tried to recruit for himself, and he volunteered, but he was too old. So 2 of his sons also served in the 54th Massachusetts. But at the time of the Civil War, Maryland was a divided state, which made its fate very difficult for President Abraham Lincoln, because he did not want it to secede from the Union, as he feared that the capital would be surrounded by the Confederacy. Lincoln worked exceedingly hard to achieve his goal of keeping Maryland in the Union, and worked with the then governor of Maryland, Thomas Hicks. Hicks was from Cambridge. Hicks obtained from the president the promise that volunteers of Maryland would be employed only in the defense of Maryland and the District of Columbia. That agreement was obtained despite the fact that the governor and the legislature desired neutrality for the state of Maryland, and the legislature often refused to provide for the means to organize Maryland militias. As a result, during the summer and fall of 1862, Maryland was 5,000 men short of meeting her quota of 8,532 men. Maryland never made this quota. Despite Governor Hicks's agreement with Lincoln to keep Maryland troops in the state and to protect the District of Columbia, some troops were sent out of the state to the eastern shore of Virginia to put down some rebellions. As a result, some members of the eastern shore began to present grievances against Maryland and the Union. And they came to believe that they had been recruited under false pretenses. Some deserted, others became ill due to want of good bread, fresh meat, and vegetables. Some men had not been paid for 4 months, and their families were suffering. More men deserted, this time in numbers of 300 at a time. But the problem was how to keep those men in service. So in order to alleviate that problem and that of desertion, some soldiers had even been promised a non-existent bounty of $200. It didn't exist, but they were told that nonetheless. So the federal government resorted to a draft asking for 300,000 military men to serve for 9 months. That measure led to such opposition that the government had to take drastic measures to restore order. Some of the measures that were used by the government included the issuance of orders that authorized the arrest of all persons suspected of discouraging enlistment. The government ordered the arrest of all persons who sought to evade military duty, which resulted in the exodus out of the state of about 1,000 persons that first week. Many went to Canada, others went wherever they could. Some of that number were from Talbot County and the rest of the the counties on the eastern shore of Maryland. The government tried to appoint substitutes any way they could. They even appointed subordinate officers to supervise enrollment and draft in the counties, because some counties voted a bounty of $100 to be given to each volunteer in order to raise their quota of men. Some residents from the eastern shore and other counties went to counties that offered lucrative bounties. Money made a difference. The recruiting officers were threatened with violence, intimidation, beatings, and some had their homes burned, as well as their lives and property threatened. Out of fear, many of those recruiting officers resigned their positions. Black recruiting officers were threatened and run out of the state. The government also tried to obtain honest examining physicians for each county. Some physicians refused to accept their appointments. Their positions were important because they certified that soldiers were fit to serve or not fit to serve. Some examining physicians accepted payments for illegal exemptions, such as bone spurs. In other words, some individuals did not want to go to war, so they would go in the front door and be examined, and as they went out the back door, they paid the examining physicians. And the result was that they were exempted, similar to modern-day FOIAs. As a result, 40% of those who were slated to be drafted were exempted from service for one reason or the other. The government also tried to solve the problem of substitutes. The problem of substitutes became a major, major problem. Those persons who had money, who wanted to evade service, would pay someone to serve in their place. And it was legal at that point in time because of what became known as the Enrollment Act of August the 9th, 1862. It stated that individuals could simply be exempted. And people began to pay from $400 to $1,500 to obtain a substitute, but the average price was $300. But as the number of soldiers decreased and people left the state, the price went up more and more and more. As a result, about 3,000 recruits failed to appear on the designated day that they were supposed to be recruited. That problem prevailed because there was not enough of a federal military presence to enforce the act. So when whites would not volunteer or use other methods to evade military service, something had to be done because the war was still raging and there was not enough men to carry on the war effort. The solution was to use free blacks and slaves because they provided an unlimited reservoir of manpower. However, that idea was opposed by most Marylanders. In March of 1863, the government passed a new Enrollment Act, which stated that the national force would include all able-bodied male citizens of the United States. And this was interpreted to include free Negroes. Still, the idea of using Negro troops was rejected, so bounties of $300 were offered to new recruits enlisting for a 3-year term. New slogans, poetry, and short stories, posters, and broadsides were devoted to themes that were designed to encourage enlistments. Regardless of the measures that were used, the recruitment of white volunteers did not happen. The quotas were never reached. In July of 1863, Maryland was ordered to organize a colored regiment. But slaveholders objected to that bill because they feared the loss of their labor force. But that did not happen. So a mere pittance of $2 was offered to encourage Maryland slaves to enlist. $2. Slaveholders immediately protested the offer. Some slave owners also protested that some recruiting agents were kidnapping their slaves and forcing them against their will into the Union Army. The recruiting agents countered that they were only enlisting the slaves of disloyal Marylanders. By the 1st of October 1863, the Lincoln administration had decided to openly authorize the recruitment of slaves in Maryland. It was decided that the mustering of freedmen would continue, but slaves would not be enlisted without the owner's consent unless military necessity dictated a change in policy. It was also agreed that loyal Marylanders would receive compensation for slaves lost through enlistment. When it came to a choice between a draft or the acceptance of slave recruits, the majority of Marylanders were prompt to choose slave recruits. By November 1st, 1863, General Order Number 329 provided for the establishment of 19 recruiting stations throughout Maryland for the enlistment of Negroes. It stipulated, and I quote, that all able-bodied freedmen, slaves of disloyal owners and bondsmen, meaning slaves, with the owner's consent would be recruited first. Freedom was guaranteed as the reward for all slaves who were mustered into the Union Army. The order designated that if, after a period of 30 days, the state quotas remained incomplete, the slaves of loyal owners would be recruited, with or without the master's consent. As compensation, it was declared that all loyal owners, whether they had given their consent or not, should receive the sum of $300 for each slave enlisted, provided the slave owners filed the proper forms known as deeds of manumission. The people on the Eastern Shore desired the enlistment of the Negro, and eventually slaves. Maybe the sentiment of many people on the Lower Eastern Shore was best expressed in a ditty that was popular at that time. It states, "In battle, wild commotion, I shouldn't at all object. If Samuel's body should stop a ball that is coming for me direct." Recruitment began in earnest around November 11, 1863. In different parts of the Eastern Shore, slaves and free blacks were recruited. For example, in Snow Hill in Worcester County, there was a Negro brass band, and a detachment of colored soldiers were on a steamer that docked there. In other words, come, join us, join us. Within 2 days, 200 slaves had been recruited, and only a few of their owners received receipts for their slaves. Free blacks were recruited during the day, but slaves were recruited at night because there was the idea that their owners would protest and violate it. The rationale was to recruit and enlistment free blacks and slaves and leave white men alone, including the draft evaders. By early December, 3,100 colored volunteers had been mustered into the Union Army, and that was in Maryland alone. But that was just the opposite for white volunteers. Almost 2,000 of the 3,100 Negro recruits from Maryland, free and slave, were enlisted from Talbot County and the rest of the Eastern Shore. But it was ironic that just 6 years prior, on March the 6th, 1857, that the United States Supreme Court ruled in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford that black men had no rights that a white man need respect. That case basically stated that people of African descent, free or enslaved, were not and could not be citizens of the United States. They had no right to sue in the federal government, in the federal courts. The Chief Supreme Court Justice at that time was Roger B. Taney from Maryland. But now that the country was in the midst of a civil war and needed able-bodied men, black men were now classified as able-bodied men and not just as property. As a result, black men, slave and free, were asked to volunteer and were actually recruited to serve. Was that not ironic? But the reality is that those black men, slave and free, did serve, and they did so valiantly. What complicated matters for recruits in Maryland was that Maryland did not provide compensation for recruits in Maryland at all. Other states did so, but Maryland did not. In Maryland, the only compensation provided was by the federal government. A Maryland state bill provided for the payment of $200 to all new volunteers and $250 for veterans to enlist for 3 years. That bill also provided that the slave owner would receive $100 for his slave who enlisted, and the slave would receive a similar bonus. The veteran was re-enlisted, and if he re-enlisted, he would receive $750. A new recruit, $600. But in most cases, the slave did not receive his promised bounty. On February 25th, 1864, another enrollment act was passed, which provided that all able-bodied colored men between the ages of 20 and 45 would be enrolled. It also provided that the master of the slave would receive a bounty of $100 when his slave was taken, and an additional compensation was given to him not to exceed $300. And that was to be paid by the appropriate commission that had been appointed by the federal government. In February of 1864, the 39th USCT was activated, but was separated from white volunteers, as were all black troops. Military schools were organized to train colored forces. Between February 12th and March the 8th of 1864, over 1,387 slaves were enlisted, even though they were not paid a bounty by the federal government. In June of 1864, it was predicted that after substitutions were completed, colored men would outnumber the whites 2 to 1. But those who could not afford to pay for substitutes, nor pay for unjustified exemptions, had only one option left open to them, and that was to volunteer, while the bounties were still very lucrative. Money talked again. Despite promises to the contrary, many colored volunteers, free and slave, did not receive their promised bounties. By the summer of 1864, the going price for American substitutes rose again from $600 to $700. But the price continued to increase, and by early September, individuals were paying over $900, and from $900 to $1,500. There are also confirmed circumstances in which serving as a substitute was such a lucrative profession that some substitutes had used so many names and have moved to so many places and obtained substitute money that they sometimes forgot their given names. Some substitutes made a lot of money. But when they did not have money to pay for a substitute, some individuals actually injured themselves by cutting off a couple of fingers so they would not be able to go to serve. When other counties paid for substitutes, Talbot County did not do so. Talbot County contracted a broker in Baltimore and allowed the broker to find substitutes for it. So the problem of substitutes was never resolved. It was simply a lucrative venture for many men, some who were truly unscrupulous, and they made a lot of money. In 4 years of war, Maryland had been called upon to supply over 70,000 soldiers to the war effort. But less than 42,000 had been mustered into the Union Army. And from that number were thousands of deserters, those who were substitutes, some who were there as a result of commutation, and many free blacks and slaves who were enlisted by their owners. Throughout the entire course of the war, 189,000 blacks served in the Union Army, but 8,108 to 8,718 came from the state of Maryland. The difference is 610. That 610 consisted of soldiers from other states that were credited to the regiments of the state of Maryland. But Maryland also had a lot of blacks who were from Alabama and other places because the owners had sent them there so that they would not be in Maryland. Okay? They were sent with family. They were sent to, they basically hired out. So when you look at the records, some individuals who were born in the state of Maryland and in Talbot County and Eastern Shore, they were recruited in Alabama and other places. Okay? So when you look at the figures, you see why there's a difference. Were they recruited here or were they recruited in other places? Of the 8,108 Negro soldiers from Maryland, 1,284 came from Worcester and Somerset counties. Of that number, 637 came from Somerset, 647 from Worcester County. But Talbot County had from 602 to 703, which are all documented. Documented, meaning we have records to show that they were from Talbot County. However, there's still a huge stack of documents of soldiers from the Eastern Shore of Maryland that requires further research because they're not listed by county, city, town, or plantation. They're simply listed as being from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So we have a bit more work to do. But the recent research about these men makes this Civil War much more personable because the information is not focused on the nation, the state, nor the region, but is focused specifically on Talbot County and this local community. Hopefully the exhibit that you will see, which has been done by the Talbot County Historical Society, has been conducted about manumitted or freed slaves and free blacks from this county, and it will help to inspire a sense of pride as the men in this exhibit gave of their blood, sweat, tears, and lives to fight for freedom, justice, and equality, the very ideals that this country was founded upon. From the names that appear on the walls of the exhibit, many residents of Talbot County will or should recognize many of their own last names, those of their relatives and neighbors, and hopefully many of them will recognize their family connections. There should be very few people in this county that are not connected to some of these men in some way, whether it is by marriage, as cousins, or as cousins of cousins. Regardless of the relationships, the family connections exist, as the same last names are still prevalent here on the shore today. The results of this exhibit can and will serve as the basis for finding families and family members who believe that they have no connection to the past other than a family name. But this exhibit, we have to put flesh on those names. The goal is that it's not just a name anymore, but a human being, one of your ancestors. The research for this exhibit has provided most of the following information. The name of each slave and free black who served in the Civil War from Talbot County. The name of the owner of each freed slave. The date of freedom. The names of those slaves or free blacks who served as substitutes. The height, complexion, color of eyes, hair color, birthplace, and occupation of each slave or free black held prior to the war. The name of the soldier. The regiment, rank and company each slave and free black served in upon enlistment, and if he was transferred or transferred himself to the Navy. The date that each soldier died and where he is buried. The date each soldier was discharged from the service. The date the former slave or free black was wounded and where. The amount of money each slave owner received for freeing each of their slaves. The amount of money each free black was supposed to have received for enlisting in the service or for volunteering. The names of deserters and when and where they deserted. And information obtained from pension records and the special census of 1870 also lists the names of the soldiers next of kin and their children's names as well. So that information can also lead to other information such as the ages, sex, and color of each slave, the number of slaves that were freed, the number of slaves that were fugitives from the state, the number of mulattoes that were fugitives from the state as well. But overall, why is this research important? And why is this exhibit important? First of all, it tells a different story about the Civil War. It tells us that local blacks also fought and died for their freedom. It tells us that thousands of slaves here in Talbot County and on the shore were free to serve in the war because their owners were told that if their slaves were not freed by a certain date between late 1864 and early 1865, their property, meaning their slaves, were going to be taxed or taken away from them. Their object was to basically sell their slaves to the federal government for up to $300 each. Now that's a far cry from saying that blacks, especially slaves, did nothing to help themselves, nor does it mention that they, the slaves, had a choice in the matter, because they did not. Overall, this exhibit is important for another reason as well. It is important because of the story of the 18 veterans who founded Unionville. Those veterans were John Blackwell, Enos Clayton, Isaac Cooper, John Copper, Benjamin Denby, William Doran, Horace Doran, Horace Gibson, Zachariah Glasgow, Joseph Gooby, Joseph H. Johnson, Peter Johnson, Enos Mooney, Frederick Pipes, Henry Roberts, Matthew Roberts, Charles Denby, William Doan, and Edward Jones. Those men, slave and free, went to war. And we don't have all of their stories, but we have some. One story is of Matthew Roberts, who entered the Union Army as a runaway slave from one of Colonel Lloyd's farms. As the story goes, when the overseers wanted to whip Matthew Roberts, he ran towards the river. He threw his hat into the river, climbed a tree, and hid in the foliage of the tree. The slave catchers presumed that he had drowned and called off the search for him. After the slave catchers left, he climbed down the tree, caught a ferry to the other side of the river, got a ride to Baltimore, and joined the Union Army. He was mustered into the United States Colored Troop 4th Regiment, Company K, as a private on September 1st, 1863. He was wounded at Chaffin's Farm in Virginia on September 29th, 1864, when he was shot through the left leg above the knee. Upon recovering from his wounds, he was in a military hospital, but he could not use his left leg because it had become paralyzed, which caused him to suffer from it for the remainder of his life. After spending time in several hospitals, he was finally granted disability and was discharged on May 11, 1866 at Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. All of those soldiers, all 18 of them, fought in various battles in 1864 and 1865 in Virginia, South Carolina, and Florida. In 1864, they fought in the Bermuda Hundred on August the 24th to the 25th at Chaffin's Farm, at Darbytown, at Petersburg, and other battles, including Deep Bottom and Jones Island and John Island in South Carolina. They also fought in Jacksonville, Florida. They joined the 7th Regiment with the 4th, the 19th, and 36th Regiments, all units in which the Unionville men served. 13 of the 18 Unionville men listed fought at Petersburg. 8 of the 18 veterans were in Appomattox Courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia on April 9, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate forces, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. 11 of the 18 would have been there if Joseph Goody, Emmett Mooney, and Henry Roberts had not been wounded and were recovering in the hospital. At the conclusion of the Civil War, these men returned to Talbot County to resume their lives, to find gainful employment, to marry, to rear families, and to hopefully enjoy their hard-won freedom. But their return home was not celebrated or appreciated by everyone as free people, including some members of their own families. No one welcomed them home as newly freed blacks. No one appreciated their service in the military or their contributions in the Civil War effort. Those men founded what became known as Unionville, in honor, and they named it in honor of the Union Army for which they had fought. Unionville remained an all-black community for over 138 years until 2 white families moved into the community in 2005. Until then, Unionville was the only all-black township in Maryland, and it remains the only black township in the nation founded by ex-slaves and United States colored troop veterans. It is still one of the few historic African-American communities set up by ex-slaves and free blacks from the USCT. It is the hope of those who created this exhibit with valor and honor, Talbot County's United States colored troops, that there will be even greater impact than just knowing the names of these men. On the surface, these names and the numbers I have shared with you in this presentation appear to be just that. But by identifying families and family connections with commonly shared names still in this area, we are putting flesh on those numbers. This data can and eventually will be used to help African Americans' families trace their heritage. Therefore, studying history and studying slavery, especially the events that led up to the Civil War and its impact on an area, especially an area such as Talbot County and the Lower Eastern Shore of Maryland, can be beneficial. And it can have some positive results, as those former slaves fought valiantly. Former slaves are free blacks, and many died for the cause. That is a legacy that is often forgotten, neglected, or is purposely left out of our history books. It is way past the time to correct those myths, perceptions, and erroneous beliefs. Together, we can learn to preserve our history. And it is a shared history. And we must, not should, but must teach the correct information to our children, to ourselves, and future generations. Such is the mission of With Valor and Honor, Talbot County's United States colored troops who served in the Civil War exhibit. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We have a lot of work to do. Thank you. You guys are so kind. Any questions? Yes.
Queen Anne's County recently created a memorial for their USCT troops. Is there any such effort underway for Talbot?
I don't know. Who's a commissioner here? And public people, you know, maybe. And I heard from someone from Freelance County as I was driving up today, they're working on their history too. And they say, well, I have tons of information about the U.S. colored troops from Queen Anne's County. I'll give it to you. I said, no, we'll work together. That took a lot of work for you to collect the data, because I know I went many times from Salisbury to Annapolis and archives. It's 93 miles one way. Oh, I know. My car, maybe on this last leg. But anyway, it's a lot of work. And I hope we can work together on it. Because we need to preserve this history. We have, no, not me. We have to preserve this history. It is a shared history. And the next generation needs to know something about their ancestors. Classic example. There's a former president of Delaware State University. His last name was Mashu. Well, he died. And someone was doing some research on the Tuskegee Airmen, for an example. And as he was doing, he said, that's an unusual name. He knew of Dr. Mashu's name. The man was a brilliant scientist. So he contacted the family. He said, he was a Tuskegee Airman. The family did not know anything about it. Oh. Less than 10 years ago, Delaware State University had a major celebration to celebrate this man who was a Tuskegee Airman. And the family and everybody got to know. I mean, that's an example of the family not even knowing. And what happens is that in war, many families, many men don't talk about what they do. So you don't know their stories. That's why we're working on different counties trying to identify the veterans of all wars. And I'm doing that on Easton Shore. Don't ask me when we're going to get to talk, okay? But the thing is to preserve the information so people would know, and the families, their children and grandchildren would know that they served and that they are standing on the shoulders of those who fought and many who died, who made the ultimate sacrifice so they have the rights and liberties that we have today. So it's going to be, I don't know how long it's going to take, but the goal is to preserve this history. And there was a comedian who said, a man who does not know his history or his heritage is like a tree without roots. A tree cannot stand nor survive if it does not have roots. And that is true about our history. We need to pass it on to the next generation. We need to make sure that the history books, and there, of course, there's a plan there to get rid of everything that's not, that is history. Women, you know, we don't do anything. We just give birth to kids, you know. Anyway, and the same thing about people, different people. We have to pass this history on to the next generation. Because that is what it was based on. And if we don't pass that information on, we're lost. We're lost. And yes, we have a shared history. We have a shared history. We must pass our history on. Otherwise, we're in trouble.
From history, those who cannot learn from history are doomed
To repeat it. And usually it's the failures. Yes.
Oh, I just like to share a quote from Talbot from Rutherford. She says, reclaiming history is generational wealth. Pass it on.
Yes. She was in Centerville on Saturday.
Right
On Saturday, yes, yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't really have a question. I work at the middle school. I'm not from here. I was intrigued by some of this history some years ago. And working with students at the middle school, simply don't believe what you're saying.
Oh, I know.
You know what I mean? Like,
We have people in politics who
Well,
don't believe it.
so I guess I have a question. How can we get the truth out so that we're not disconnected from the past? It's like those 18 names you're talking about, like, I know 2 of those families right now with the same last name still. Like, how do we not know how close we are still to that history?
Well, it means maybe we have to take it on ourselves.
Well, that's why I'm supposed at work right now, but
Okay.
I saw you.
Okay.
I have to go right down the street. I got to
Okay.
But like, how can we get this thing out here so that I think one of the biggest things it's so easy to divide us now, male, women, black, white, whatever. I think we can kind of take a look back at history. We can kind of see that it wasn't so easily divided. There were white folks that hated slavery. They were assisting us getting, like, I think we need to get that truth out so that we can kind of dismiss this
The
fool.
shared history, yes. But see, here's
The
the
shared history, yes, it's not just black and white history.
It's not. And we come in all colors too. And this is black and white, I'm serious. But what I'm saying is that maybe each of us need to step back in order to move forward. Meaning, take it upon ourselves to teach ourselves, teach our friends, our family, and kids, and keep sharing. And another thing is, you know, we have a lot of churches that are open at night and they choir practice for this day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I once proposed, and I had some friends, and they asked me to come in for Black History Month. I said, okay. I said, you know, this church is open 4 nights a week. You pay the electricity, you pay for water. I have some friends who will teach English, community service. I will do history. Somebody who will teach science. Have someone who will do French. Someone who will do Spanish. The church said no. I said, it's just during the time that you're open, we can teach the kids. You know, tutor them, those who needed help. They said no. I never went back to do Black History Month. Because I was extremely hurt. These are people who were college professors and people in the community who were willing to give up their time. We saw that as our community investment because my parents always told us, and I'm from North Carolina, a little southern girl, they always said, wherever you are, become a part of that community. If you cannot help, don't hinder. And so I'm giving up my time, but I will continue to do it if somebody is willing to help. But what I'm saying is that we may have to take it upon ourselves. Each one, give one. Each one, teach the next one. That may be a way to get it started. And because we have to do something. Because this division in this country has to stop. We are hating each other and we don't know each other. My parents also said, get to know the individual. Let the rest take care of itself. Because once you get to know a person, you don't look at color, sex, none of that other stuff. So that may be a way to do it.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
To the gentleman's point, I think we seem to have forgotten one of the most basic things. We have to read.
Yeah.
We simply have to read. I had the benefit of having a grandfather who I sat at his knee many a day, and I learned so much. He farmed, he drove a bus, he knew people, but he also had stories about his family. And so I learned so much from him about my family. But I wanted to just switch gears a little bit and ask you, you mentioned something about pensions. And so I'm familiar with the Dorchester County research. I'd like you to just tell a snippet about the Thomas Woolford family.
Oh my gosh. Oh. Okay. Woolford, I think Woolford was one of the individuals in the Dorchester County family that we wrote about. When we did the book on Black slavery-free who served in Dorchester County, we had one section. We always chose a slave and a free person. And I think Wolford, it's been a while, Wolford came back, and I think he was injured, I'm trying to remember, and he was determined to survive. He had a prosthetic, but it wouldn't fit right. But he was determined to survive. He got married, he had kids. He farmed near, Christchurch, on the road towards Church Creek, Route 16. And he was determined to survive. He needed a pension. He needed to survive. He had children. He fought for his pension. And he fought until he died. His wife continued to fight for the pension. She finally got a pension for him. Many soldiers, even though they had a disability as a result of the war, and because they served, they did not receive it until they got some people in the community to help support them. That's how she finally got a pension for them. Now, pensions were given, but not everybody received a pension. Not everybody. And a lot of black soldiers never did get their pension and did not receive a lot of the medical care they were supposed to receive either. Yeah, everything about the war was not good. Well, let me rephrase that. Wars are bad, period. They're bad. They're bad. But the results of it usually is supposed to be for the benefit of the people. But there are some really, really bad consequences of war. And wars make strange bedfellows. They always make strange bedfellows. And until we figure out a way to stop having wars and killing each other, yeah, we got to do something. We have to do something. Yes?
When you mentioned the state archives as a place that you went and traveled to research, can you talk a little bit about other places that you did research locally to some of the books that you've written and research that you've done?
Well, start with your counties, your documents in your counties and historical societies. I talked to individuals who have maybe even mentioned that they had ancestors who served in different wars. National archives, those are places I would go. And also, there is a wonderful series of files called Fold 3. They're online. They're online. But also check against some local records as well. Let's just say things are a lot easier than they were about 15 years ago because of the computer and Fold 3. And a lot of those documents are available to you. They are available. But you also need to check your local records, And some VFWs have some records too, because they've been collecting information if the individuals belong to the VFWs or American Legions and other areas. Yeah. So it's a lot easier than it has been, because when I started doing this about 20 years ago and examining the U.S. colored troops records, one sheet could be like this and like that. So the little carols that they use and the archive didn't fit. So I would get there by 9:15 in the morning, and they see me coming in the door. And plus, I had 2 students, homeward grad students who worked there. I let them know I'm on my way. I'll be there tomorrow. So they would have the card catalogs, about 3 of them together. And that's what it took to go through each of those line by line by line. And if you have anyone who can intercede for you, and if you go into the archives, let them know in advance, because sometimes they are slow to bring out the records. I mean, the school's so slow. Seriously. They're open on some Saturdays too, but not all day. And I don't think they're open on Mondays. But I have to go back and check some other records before I finish publishing some
other days.
So, you know, I was interested in what the gentleman back here said about a monument. I recall reading that when the Talbot Boys Monument was presented in 2014, one of the funders said, well, if they want a monument to the Union soldiers, they can raise the money to create it. And that kind of stuck with me because I've always wondered, you know, there were the Talbot Boys that went with the Confederate, but how many people went to the North? I know that Talbot County voted to go with the North, although Easton voted to go with the South. So there's interesting dynamic history there. But maybe it's time we raise the money to make a monument to the Union soldiers that fought from Talbot County. I mean, you know, we have the Vietnam Memorial. I think we have a World War II memorial, but we don't have a Civil War memorial for the Union soldiers. And I think the gentleman back there mentioned that. I think it's a great idea. We ought to do it. Yeah. Well, let's work together. I mean, you know, there's obviously a lot of energy in the room, and that might be a great thing to do.
Could be, but might be good to start with knowing history first. And that may work. That might work. And the other thing is, we need to know real history, the history, and then maybe people will understand it better. And in some instances, the Civil War is still being fought by some people.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Dr. Smalls, I'm Al Silverstein, president of the Talbot Historical Society of Talbot County. I just want to invite everybody to the soft opening we're having at the museum when we conclude this meeting. So please feel free to come over and get a preview. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned how many black soldiers were in Africa. How many was that?
I think it was 11 of us. I'll double check. Yeah,
And that's, they're not the 12 counties.
oh, no.
Yes.
I was just mentioning Talbot County. Just talking.
All those 11 were 12 counties.
Thank you all for coming. So wonderful. I'm going to be around. I can talk forever, so I am here to answer your questions.